And I call the honourable member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, and supporting many of the elements of this motion today, I think it's important probably to look at the work that's occurring in Canada at the moment in addressing some of the issues of the export of asbestos to developing economies, and that's an area I will focus on this morning. What we do know is that in Quebec there are two, I think, small mines that are still exporting chrysotile to developing economies like India and parts of Africa. And this is of great concern because a number of tactics have been used to try and bring that trade to an end, and so far they've been unsuccessful. This does, of course, a motion like this, it does draw our minds to what we're actually doing in this country. And I think the Australian Labor Party's position on uranium is not so dissimilar to the debate we're having today about asbestos. That's that great tension about whether we can actually mine something and export it overseas, even though we choose not to use it domestically. And while I think it's great to bring a euphemistic motion before this chamber, it's important to remember that if you just take a slightly different look at another mineral, then in many cases you'll find that the very movers of this motion are actually doing exactly the same with a different element. That said, we can look at Canada and understand that some very, very powerful coalitions are now forming to pressure this country to revise its position on the export of
Order. Order. Well, the member has resumed his seat. The honourable member for Shortland.
Question to the member, if I could.
Under the standing orders, the honourable member is able to seek an intervention. Will the honourable member accept the intervention? Yes, the honourable member for Shortland.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. My question to the member is in relation to uranium and the position, his argument that he's putting before the House there. Is he arguing that Australia should not export uranium? If so, and is he arguing that uranium has creates the same medical side effects and caused by the mining of it as does asbestos?
I think the honourable member has asked a question. The honourable member for Bowman in response.
And an excellent question, which I hope to answer as I progress through the speech. So what we have here is a tension both with the Prime Minister in Canada and the Premier in Quebec, who both find themselves tacitly supporting the continued export. Now, I think the concern for many who are opposed to effectively the transfer of asbestos into developed economies, where both the understanding, the knowledge and the regulation of the use of this product is fairly limited, what responsibility does a developed economy have to make sure that that is done fairly and safely? And the answer probably is, in the current arrangements, very, very little. Now, some have attempted to use the Rotterdam Treaty, which focuses on pesticides, as a way to prevent what is, as they would argue, the use of a product that can be, in an almost theoretical sense, used safely. Now, while the figures diverge, the Canadian government-sponsored Chrysotile Institute will say that it is 99.8% safe to use asbestos under certain conditions, and I think everyone in this chamber would know that those conditions don't exist around the world. The figures, the best figures we have about the number of deaths due to asbestos is even higher than I think the member has provided earlier. If you take all of the deaths in the developed world, it's in the order of 100,000 per year. So we need to be balancing that morally against the economic impact for economies, and we choose Canada because it's a developed economy, and the wealthiest of the asbestos exporters are the price that they would pay if they were to cease the export of asbestos. And the answer is there probably are, 200 to 500 jobs in those mines. Some would argue that those mines are already economically barely above water. Many of them are still relying on government sponsorship to survive. So this is a sector that is struggling, and we also know that there is direct support, obviously, from the government, both in a very financially favourable loan to expand a new mine, but also the Canadian government has obviously a link where they support the Chrysotile Institute to prepare newsletters like this, which I found of enormous interest, because this is a 12-page document that promotes the safe use of asbestos, and it even includes beautifully illustrated headers showing smiling children from developing economies who are obviously delighted that asbestos is arriving on their shores. So with further reading, what it actually effectively is saying is that asbestos can be safely, responsibly used under controlled circumstances. They then go into significant detail to convince the world that there is no longer any exposure theory, that it is no longer the case that any form of exposure can lead to cancer. Well, while I regard that as being of intellectually fascinating detail in this document, in a practical sense it's a complete waste of space and a waste of time and a waste of taxpayers' money, if I could make that observation from across the other side of the Pacific. So their case is this, that the current government doesn't want to lose a couple of seats in Quebec. They don't want the backlash that could occur if there were to be some restrictions on the mining of asbestos, and that fundamentally a developed economy doesn't really have any concern for how a product, once it leaves the shores, is used when it arrives in the market that has purchased it. And this should be of enormous concern, and it does sound a little bit like the tobacco industry, and as I've said already, it sounds a little bit like the Australian Labor Party's approach to uranium. Now, let's be very, very clear about this. There are extreme statements on both sides, and I will just allude to a few of these. I mean, the first of them is that we're seeing, particularly in Canada, very few politicians prepared to speak out about this topic, and we're only just starting to see some cracks here with the NDP, some federal Liberals, and of course Canadian unions now, outside of Quebec, starting to support the words of the previous speaker. But if you look a little closer at who graces the pages of these Canadian government-funded newsletters, it is, yes, you guessed it, the union movement. And right at the top of it, you'll be interested to read, the chrysotile asbestos, Labor unions from Quebec are on the front lines, Deputy Speaker, the front lines fighting hard on this issue to continue the export of asbestos. Well, I think it's just worth making sure that that is on the public record, because that's printed by a Canadian government-funded newsletter, which is, of course, headed up by an institute that is itself run and owned by someone who previously owned an asbestos mine. So it does appear to get murkier. And while I can't pretend to fully understand the asbestos ins and outs in Canada, it's also interesting to see some of the rhetoric that is suffused through these Canadian government-sponsored newsletters. And one of them is, we have been vigilant and perseverant in defending the rights of workers. Now that certainly evokes, language of the front lines of the left, doesn't it? Well, these are the guys who are defending, the jobs of the people who dig this stuff up, the very people that you would potentially put out of work, 200 to 300 of them, and there's probably another 500 that are indirectly associated with asbestos export, but to save the lives of 100,000 people. I mean, it has to start somewhere, doesn't it? So I think if you bring a motion to this place, you need to realise that the case being made to continue the status quo, it isn't always powerful industry, is it? It can sometimes be a Labor union. It can sometimes be a government that's defending its own economic interests. And I just place that before the chamber. That's called that newsletter for the safe and responsible use of chrysotile. And of course, when they make the case, they leave the word asbestos out, because that's a little bit distasteful these days, isn't it? So instead we use the chemical name to try and avoid any insensitivity. Look, in short, every health organisation you've ever heard of will talk about the dangers of asbestos and that more needs to be done. And what we have here is one developed economy that certainly doesn't appear to be doing enough. You can call it indifference, but you can also just call it a focus on a domestic economy. Look, parts of Quebec are probably not doing that well at the moment, and that those few hundred jobs, let's be honest, support families who would be extremely disadvantaged were they to be transitioned into other forms of the economy. So we have to be looking for solutions to that if we are to aspire to those noble aspirations that are being mentioned in the previous speaker's motion. Now, I'm not saying that any politician is an enthusiastic advocate of asbestos. Obviously they're not. But I think it's also important to point out the tensions that, the very residence of the Canadian Prime Minister is currently having asbestos removed from it. The House of Commons in Canada in recent years has had the asbestos removed from it. So the argument is, can we really expect that it's completely fair to be exporting asbestos at exactly the same time? Both of these parties, both within Quebec and in Canada, find themselves in a situation where it's only really continued government support that keeps these mines up and running. But the mines continue to do that. They continue to export, and we see some of the dreadful morbidity that's referred to.
The honourable member's time has expired.